Clarissa Belmont, that holy mask of yours is the worst thing I've ever seen. I said that the moment I found the blacklist she hid at the bottom of her safe, names of women who had been handled to protect the reputation of the Belmont sub-branch. It was the kind of evidence that froze me to the bone, but just a few seconds later, everything flipped. When I opened my mother's final letter, I finally learned my true identity, the one who holds the supreme authority of the original Belmont bloodline. So, if you were me, would you bow your head in silence before someone like Clarissa, or would you rise to reclaim your daughter-in-law's life? Would you choose fear, or would you burn down that filthy branch of the family? If you want to know what I chose, hit subscribe and comment "Continue" right now. This story is only just beginning. I am Margaret Belmont, the one who carries the blood of the main branch of the Belmont family, a name that makes the entire town of Crestfall bow whenever they hear it. Since the day I was born, I was raised with the belief that women of the main branch are symbols of honor, the center of values preserved across generations. Women of the main branch must never be weak, my mother once said, not as pressure, but as a reminder that we were protected to the point of being untouchable. Because of that status, my husband, Thomas Belmont, has never dared raise his voice at me since the day we married. Not because he is gentle, but because he is afraid. The sub-branch he belongs to, though wealthy and influential, is still one level below the main branch. To them, touching me would be the same as declaring war on the entire family. And I know that. I know it very clearly. But for years, I never used that power to frighten anyone. I lived quietly, preserving the family's image, believing that what I saw was real, good, moral, the way they always presented themselves in public. But that is the nature of power. When you are placed too high, people will find every way to shield your eyes from the truth. I was respected, welcomed at every community event, praised with every compliment. They looked at me and said I was the embodiment of the Belmont main branch, but they never knew that this image only existed because I was not allowed to see anything else beneath the surface. The sub-branch led by Clarissa and Thomas always kept me at a safe distance. I lived in the guest house at the far end of the estate, a private space designed with elegance, so quiet that at times I felt more like a visitor than a resident. I was not forbidden from anything, but they always made sure I didn't need to worry about the matters in the main house, a phrase repeated so many times over the years that I became accustomed to it and eventually stopped asking questions. Time passed, and I truly believed my family was the most exemplary family in the region. But truth always waits patiently for the right moment to reveal itself. Things began to shift when Emily entered the house. She was an outsider, not of Belmont blood, and because of that, she lacked the invisible wall of protection that I had. At first, I thought she was simply adjusting, trying to adapt to the traditions of a large family. But the more I observed, the more I realized something was wrong. Emily avoided interaction whenever Clarissa appeared. Her eyes would lower, tension settling across her face despite the polite smile on her lips. Every time a door closed a bit too loudly, her body jolted as if reacting to an attack. Once, when I touched her arm lightly, she flinched so hard she dropped her glass. Emily apologized immediately, but the panic in her eyes was something no one could fake. I tried asking, but she only said the same familiar words, "I'm okay, Mom." That okay chilled me more than anything else. I began noticing family dinners where Emily sat completely still, as if every word she spoke could trigger consequences. I saw the way Ryan looked at her, the way Clarissa nodded approvingly whenever she stayed silent. And there was Thomas, the husband I once thought was merely rigid. giving me looks that warned me not to interfere. A dark intuition wrapped around me for many nights. I had no evidence, but my heart knew something was rotting in this house. Something I had not seen, had not touched, yet it grew like a shadow spreading across every room. I told myself I was being paranoid. I reminded myself that women in big families sometimes overthink small things. But that intuition refused to leave. It crept into every corner, into Emily's footsteps, into Thomas's evasive eyes whenever I asked even the simplest questions. Until that afternoon, the afternoon I walked into the main house without announcing myself. The afternoon the wall of lies built around the Belmont family, a wall shaped by decades of reputation and false virtue, collapsed right in front of me. I did not know that moment would change my life and the fate of our entire bloodline, but it did, and there was no turning back. I remember that afternoon clearly, the sunlight falling across the marble hallway of the main house like a thin layer of gold, yet cold. I walked in intending to find Emily and talk to her because the uneasiness I had carried for days had grown into a tension I could no longer ignore. The air in the house was strangely quiet, as if something was lurking, waiting for me to stumble into it. I moved deeper into the living room and froze. Ryan was standing in front of Emily. His eyes were darkened, and Emily stepped back, little by little, her hands raised slightly in front of her chest like an instinctive shield. I barely heard Ryan muttering something, his voice full of irritation and resentment. Emily whispered a tiny explanation, her voice trembling and thin. I opened my mouth to call his name, to stop whatever was happening, but the moment happened before I could speak. Ryan swung his hand. His palm crashed against Emily's face with a sharp, cracking sound, so loud I felt it in my bones. Emily was struck sideways, her body tilting completely, then hitting the marble floor with a thud that made my heart collapse. Everything inside me froze. I opened my mouth to scream, but before any sound could escape, a noise behind me cut through the air, colder than the slap itself. Clapping. I turned, and there was Clarissa. She stood straight, like she was watching a performance executed exactly the way she wanted. Her face showed no shame, no discomfort, only a satisfied glimmer. Clarissa clapped slowly, her voice carrying a hint of mockery, a hint of approval. You did well. She needs to be shaped. I was stunned. I knew Clarissa was domineering, knew she always wanted control, knew she saw herself above any woman who entered this family. But I never imagined she would stand there watching my son hit his wife and applaud as if it were some kind of family ritual. Emily pushed herself up slowly, hand over her cheek. Her eyes glistened, not because of the pain, but because of the humiliation laid bare in front of me. She looked at me as if afraid I would think she was the one causing trouble. Then she spoke, her voice tightening as though holding back tears while trying to stay composed. I'm sorry you had to see that, Mom. That sentence gripped my heart like a tightening fist. Why was she apologizing when she was the one being hurt? Why did she think it was her fault that I saw this? I had never seen Emily so small, so exposed, so wounded. I stepped toward her, ready to help her up, but Ryan grabbed her shoulder and pulled her back, as if my touch on her was something that shouldn't happen. I looked at Ryan's hand squeezing her, and something rose inside me, a quiet but fierce rage, like a fire pressed down for too long, waiting for the exact moment to erupt. I looked at Ryan, then at Clarissa, then at Thomas, who entered the room from afar, wearing an expression as if this scene was entirely normal. In that moment, I understood why Emily's face drained of color every time Clarissa appeared. why she flinched at the sound of a door closing, why those small bruises on her arms appeared, then vanished as if no one was allowed to ask. I wanted to ask Ryan what he thought he was doing, wanted to ask Clarissa whether she believed she was behaving like a human or a monster, but my throat locked. The terror in Emily's eyes told me more than any explanation could. I inhaled deeply, my hands trembling from anger and shock. Every image of a model family, every value I had ever believed in, every year I took pride in carrying the Belmont Maine bloodline, suddenly twisted into something grotesque. It was as if everything I had built, everything I had protected, was only a beautiful painting masking a pit of darkness behind it. I looked at Ryan, at Clarissa, at Emily, and realized I had been slow for too long, trusting for too long, standing outside for too long, until the moment I stepped in, the truth had already become an abscess ready to burst. And at that moment, right there in the living room, where this family's honor had been built for generations, I realized something that chilled me completely. I realized this wasn't the first time, but a system, and I knew I was about to tear that system apart. I brought Emily back to my guest house, the place few dared to step into because they always believed this space belonged to the main branch. She walked slowly, one hand holding her cheek, the other gripping her shirt as if trying to keep herself from shaking. I opened the door, pulled her inside, then locked it to block every gaze from the main house. The room was softly lit, a familiar space that suddenly felt suffocating as I watched Emily standing in the middle like a fading shadow. I placed my hand on her shoulder, intending to ask if the pain was bad, but when her sleeve slipped just a little, the haunting truth began to show. Underneath was a large, spreading bruise, like a black flower pressed into her skin. I saw long scratch marks running down her back and older bruises turning yellow, while newer ones still burned red. They blended together like a map of suffering she had endured in silence. I touched one lightly with the tip of my finger, and Emily inhaled sharply, her body recoiling with a fear that tore at my heart. "When did this happen?" I asked, my voice low but heavy like stone. She did not answer right away. She stared at the floor for a long moment, then sat down on a chair, her hands resting on her thighs, nails pressing into her skin to keep steady. I sat beside her, waiting for her to gather the strength to speak. After a while, Emily whispered, "You weren't supposed to see me like this." I told her to look at me, and when her eyes met mine, tears began falling without permission. She took a breath as if choosing every word carefully to avoid breaking what little courage she had left. "They made me kneel to apologize because I dodged the slap," Emily said, her voice cracking halfway through, as if the confession itself deepened the pain. It took me a few seconds to understand. When I did, my whole body chilled as if I had stepped into winter. "You dodged the slap," I repeated each word, slicing through my awareness. Emily nodded. "I reacted without thinking, and Clarissa said I was disrespectful. She told Ryan he had to teach me or I would shame the family. Then they pulled me to the floor, forced me to kneel, forced me to apologize for not knowing my place." I listened to every word, feeling as though something was tightening around my throat. They hadn't just hit her. They wanted her to kneel. They wanted her to believe this pain was right, that it was her duty to endure it, to fit into the mold Clarissa created. "How many times has this happened?" I asked. Emily swallowed, her eyes flicking toward the door as if fearing someone might appear. "So many times, I can't remember. It started as small arguments, then grew, then became routine." Clarissa stood there watching Ryan did exactly what she said, and Thomas, he said it was a family matter, not something to escalate. I felt a fire building in my chest. It didn't flare loudly, it burned slowly, deeply, sharply. Thomas knew everything I said. Emily nodded. He said the sub-branch had to uphold order, that women outside the main bloodline needed to be softer so the family wouldn't lose face. They said it like everything made perfect sense. Every word she spoke pulled down another curtain, hiding the truth I had been kept away from for far too long. In that small room, the darkness of my family revealed itself beyond the reach of rituals, elegance, or the model image they had constructed for years. Emily lowered her head, her fingers interlaced so tightly they turned white. I didn't dare tell you because they always kept you away from everything. I was scared that if I said anything, they would go further. I placed my hand over hers, feeling like I needed to hold her together, as if letting go would cause her to break into pieces. No one is allowed to hurt you anymore. Emily looked at me, her eyes red and swollen. You don't understand. They can do anything to silence me. You don't know what they've done to others. Before I tightened my grip on her hand. Then tell me everything. She trembled, but she nodded. And as she began to speak, I realized that what I had heard so far was only the first door. Behind it stretched a long hallway filled with shadows, and each step forward would bring me closer to the truth of my own family. Emily drew a breath. There's something even worse, she said, and I knew I was about to hear something that would change both our lives. After hearing everything Emily had been forced to endure, I sat still for a long time. Inside my chest, something was shifting, heavy, like a stone pressed into my ribs, yet sharp like a blade slicing through the false shell this family had worn for years. I rose from my seat, and it felt as if my own feet knew the way to the only place that might hold the answers, Thomas's office in the main house. I opened the door and stepped inside the familiar room, smelling of polished wood and old paper. Light from the window spilled across the desk where the safe Thomas always locked sat like a metal sentinel. I had seen him open it many times, usually before family meetings or when entertaining important guests. He believed I didn't know the code, but Thomas forgot one thing. Men like him can change their tone, change their attitude, but they cannot change a habit set over many years. He always entered his own birth date. I walked up to the safe, laid my hand on the cold steel surface, and entered the numbers. The mechanism turned slowly, then clicked open. Inside was a stack of documents, not many, but each placed with the kind of neatness that meant Thomas accessed them often. I pulled them out, each sheet hitting me like a strike to the senses. And then I saw it, a dossier stamped with the year 2017 on the corner, sealed in a plastic sleeve. I opened it, and the first image left me motionless. A woman's face swollen with bruises, one eye puffed shut, her lips split, her cheek stained with shades of blue and purple like spilled ink. She stared into the camera with fear covering every trace of expression, the same fear I had seen in Emily. I read the victim's name, then the account of the incident, and when my eyes stopped at the line identifying the perpetrator, a familiar name jolted my heart. Ryan Belmont. My son. The boy I once believed was only moody, temperamental, withdrawn, but not a monster. I stood there, my hands trembling slightly, feeling layers of trust slip from me like dry leaves swept away by the wind. I turned to the next page, which held the hospital report, injury verification, the initial witness statements, and then the page that unlocked everything that had been buried. A payment receipt, a large sum, and at the bottom was Thomas Belmont's signature. I read every curve of his pen, firm and deliberate, as if stamping validity onto a crime. Beneath the receipt was a note so simple it felt cruel. The victim's family agreed to withdraw the complaint after negotiation. Do not escalate due to reputation. Reputation. One word the sub-branch wielded as an excuse for acts no one should ever defend. I dug deeper into the documents, and each one was another story smothered, quickly bought off, bent into silence to preserve the family's polished exterior. The same cold notes reappeared. Handled internally, not to be publicized, resolved. I didn't know how long I stood there. The room dimmed as clouds swallowed the sunlight, and everything around me seemed to darken along with the truth I had just uncovered. Ryan was not the first. He was not the only one. And his violence wasn't the outburst of a moment. It was habit, a rot passed down through the sub-branch and protected by money, power, and the silence of people like Thomas and Clarissa. Another truth formed clearly, even before I saw it. Those past victims were not protected. They were bought off, threatened, erased. My family had built an entire system that covered every stain with a pristine white cloth, a system designed so the world would see us as honorable, moral, admirable. I placed the folder on the desk, inhaled sharply, then looked back into the open safe. Something else was inside, thinner than the folders I had pulled out. A black envelope pressed into the far corner, almost deliberately hidden beneath other papers. I reached for it, the paper cold and unusually heavy. And when my fingers touched the edge of the envelope, a chill ran down my spine. I knew what lay inside was not just another file. It was something Thomas kept for himself, something the sub-branch never wanted anyone outside their circle to see, something that had shaped their actions for years. I held the envelope in my hand, standing beside the safe, gaping open like a mouth, trying to swallow its secrets back again. I stared at it for a long moment, then opened it. Inside was not a folder, but a list, a blacklist I had never known existed. I stood still for a long moment, the heavy black envelope in my hand, feeling as though it carried not just papers, but the very darkness of my family. The light in the room dimmed as clouds rolled over the window, giving me the sense that I was standing in a space drained of all warmth. Everything I had just read in Ryan's file was enough to shatter the trust I once held, but my intuition told me that whatever lay inside this envelope was far worse. I opened it slowly, my hands trembling. Inside was a thin stack of papers bound neatly by a small string. I untied it and turned to the first page. A title appeared in sharp handwriting, as if Thomas had tried to mark it with an unsettling formality. Family Honor Preservation Fund. A name so pristine it felt ironic because I knew anything tied to the sub-branch held no true honor at all. I flipped to the next page and my chest tightened at once. A long list of names, each one representing a story, strangled, erased, pushed into shadow. My eyes settled on the first name, Marilyn. The note beside it read simply, "Missing." I stared at the line as if it glowed on the page. Marilyn had once worked in one of the household departments, and I remembered her shy smile during gatherings. I thought she had moved away. That was what everyone said, and no one asked further. Now I understood why. The second name, Grace. Beside her name, suspicious suicide. Grace had been involved with someone from the sub-branch, and I remembered her as gentle and soft-spoken, always polite. I had no idea she had died, and even less that her death was recorded in 2 chilling words, the third name, Julia. The note read, "Forced into psychiatric hospital." I had to pause before my eyes could continue. Julia had once accused someone in the family of wrongdoing, and weeks later she was taken for treatment. No one mentioned her again. I remembered asking Thomas about her, and he said she had long-standing psychological issues. Now, as I looked at this page, the truth sat right here, bare and cruel enough to freeze the spine. I turned each page, and every name was another blow to my consciousness. All were women. All had crossed paths with the Belmont sub-branch in one way or another. And all had been handled through different methods, yet with the same purpose: to silence them, to crush their voices, in order to protect what they called family honor. When I thought I had reached my limit, the final page appeared. Emily Carter Belmont. My daughter-in-law's name sat at the bottom like a final punctuation mark that refused to be ignored. My heart pounded so hard I had to sit down immediately. The note beside her name felt like being shoved into a void. Handle if resistant. I read those 4 words over and over, unable to grasp how they could write something so vicious. As if Emily was not a person, but an object they could discard at will if she no longer suited their designs. I thought of the bruises on her shoulder, the fear in her eyes, the "I'm sorry" that trembled from her throat. I placed the list on the table and struck the surface with my palm. The sound echoed heavily, sending a small cloud of dust drifting up from the wood. "You planned to erase her from this world," I said aloud, each word carrying the fury I had held back too long. I stood, anger rising so intensely it made my breath feel shallow. The moral image this family had displayed for years was nothing but a grand stage masking cables rusted with corruption. I once believed my family was the moral fortress of this town, but clearly all I had ever seen was a glossy paper wrapping layered over sins they crushed into the women weaker than them. I picked up the list and turned to leave the room, ready to confront Thomas. But when I glanced back, I noticed something inside the envelope still remained. A thin sheet of paper pressed to the bottom so snugly I had nearly missed it. I pulled it out and lifted it toward the light. And within a single second, a cold sensation ran the length of my spine, colder than anything I had just read in that list of names. I knew instantly that I had touched something that made the entire matter far more terrifying than I imagined, and I understood this was something capable of unraveling the truth I thought I already knew. The thin sheet of paper I had just pulled from the envelope remained cold even after I'd held it for a while. I stood in Thomas's office, my breath brushing against an invisible barrier where the truth waited to be uncovered. I unfolded the paper, the old creases faint with age, yet every handwritten stroke sharp as if freshly inked. I recognized the handwriting immediately, though I had tried to forget it for years. It was my mother's handwriting, Eleanor Belmont. My breath hitched. My mother died when I was young, and every word she left behind had been treated by the family as sacred relics. But why was her letter inside Thomas's safe? Why did he keep it? And why was it hidden so deeply that I had to dig through the black fund to reach it? I opened the letter fully, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the feeling of hearing the past speak again, a voice that had never once been wrong with me. "Margaret, there are things you cannot be allowed to see when you are still young." I read the first line, each word passing through my mind like a cold wind carrying an omen. The sub-branch has strayed from the original ethics. I paused, unable to look away from that line, feeling a surge of realization ripple through me. My mother had seen this long before I was old enough to understand that within the Belmont family, not everyone walked in the light we were taught to admire. I continued reading, my fingers gripping the edge of the page. The main bloodline is protected because it carries the pure values, but the sub-branch always wants to climb, to take power, to bend all women to their will. I heard her voice through every word, stern yet gentle, as if she were standing behind me whispering her warnings. My eyes dropped to the middle of the letter, where the strokes of her pen became more urgent. Any daughter-in-law who does not belong to the main line will be destroyed. My heartbeat slammed against my chest like a hammer. Emily. Everything she had endured, every bruise, every fear, every forced apology, every threat, every moment she had been broken into silence, all of it echoed the prophecy my mother had written years before. I read the sentence again, as if carving it into my memory. She knew. She had seen the future. I was too blind to notice. I kept reading, the waves of pain and anger rising inside me. The sub-branch believes they have the right to decide the fate of women outside the main bloodline. They want to control, to mold, to erase anyone who resists. Every word brushed the dust from decades of denial, revealing the truth I had just found in Thomas's safe. The victim list, the women who disappeared, were silenced, institutionalized, all of them matching my mother's warning. I swallowed hard, a tight knot forming in my throat. The final line in the paragraph made my skin prickle. If this ever happens, you must protect the women who enter your house, no matter who the enemy is. I exhaled, hands trembling slightly, then turned to the closing of the letter. My mother's handwriting grew slower, more deliberate, as though she was placing her hands on my shoulders one last time. If one day you witness injustice rising, if you see a woman being cornered, broken, treated as a sacrifice, you must not look away. I felt a chill run through me, as if she were standing right in front of me. You must become the one who delivers judgment. I clenched the letter, overwhelmed by a surge of emotion that was both painful and fierce. I understood now why this letter had been hidden. I understood why Thomas never wanted me to read it. If I had known too early, he would never have been able to run the sub-branch the way he did. If I had known, I would have become the one he feared the most. I stood in the center of the room, the letter glowing in my hand, like a spark rising from my bloodline, a flame my mother had passed to me the day I was born, the flame of the true Belmont line, a flame the sub-branch could never touch. I read the final line of the letter again. If this ever happens, you must become the one who delivers judgment. I lifted my head, and in that moment, everything inside me awakened. All the suffering Emily endured, the secrets in the safe, the victims list, the violence files, Clarissa's applause, Ryan's slap, Thomas's silence, everything pointed to a single truth. I knew what my mother wanted me to do. I knew my role was far greater than the decorative position Thomas and Clarissa believed I held. Now was the time to fulfill her command. Now was the time for me to rise. I walked out of Thomas's room with my mother's letter in hand and the black list still carved into my mind. Cold air swept through the long hallway of the main house, carrying the familiar scent of old Belmont wood. But this time I no longer saw dignity or tradition in this place. Everything resembled a velvet-wrapped prison where women were crushed under the name of honor. I inhaled deeply, quickening my steps, because I knew what I was about to do would be a turning point with no return. Emily was sitting at the end of the hallway, her gaze lowered, as if trying to shrink into herself after all the pain she had endured. When she saw me approaching, she stood up abruptly, worry crossing her face, as if she feared she had caused more trouble. I took her hand, feeling the trembling seep through her skin. In that moment, I knew I was no longer a bystander, but the last wall between her and an entire branch of cruelty. We took only a few steps before the sound of shoes striking the floor echoed behind us. I turned and saw Clarissa and Ryan appear like two storms arriving to crush anything they deemed defiance. Clarissa marched straight toward me, her face wearing that familiar mask of arrogance. Ryan stood just behind her, fire burning in his eyes, as if my escorting Emily away had insulted him before the entire world. Clarissa stopped a few paces from me. "Where do you think you're taking her?" she asked, her voice cold as carved stone. I looked directly into her eyes, letting her see the truth reflected in someone who had just uncovered everything she had buried for years. "From this moment," I said, each word falling like metal, "anyone who touches Emily again will face the original branch." Clarissa's eyes widened. She had seen anger in the main branch before, seen annoyance, seen resistance, but she had never seen anyone stand before her and declare war like that. Her face twisted, her eyes reddened, as if I had insulted her lineage. "The main branch? So what?" Clarissa screamed, her voice sharp like a blade. "This is my house to rule. I run the sub-branch. I enforce the family code. I decide who lives quietly and who doesn't." I stepped forward. "Your sub-branch exists because the original branch allowed it, and now I'm taking that permission back." Clarissa stiffened as though she had been struck, but Ryan reacted faster. He stepped forward, shoved my hand off Emily, then gripped her wrist with so much force I heard her stifle a painful breath. Emily lowered her head, her fear resurfacing in the way her shoulders curled inward. It was a look I had seen too many times in her, the look of someone conditioned to believe she was not allowed to resist. "You have no authority here, Ryan," said his voice low and threatening. "Family matters stay in the sub-branch. You don't get to interfere." In that moment, something erupted inside me. Gone was the fear of reputation, the hesitation, the desire to maintain harmony. Everything dissolved. What remained was fury rising from the depths of my blood, the very fury my mother had predicted and handed down through her final words. I yanked Emily out of Ryan's grasp and stepped between them like a shield. I locked eyes with him, seeing in them the arrogance of someone who had never been restrained, someone raised by the sub-branch on entitlement and violence. "From now on," I said, "every decision is mine." Clarissa laughed, a bitter laugh soaked in disbelief. "And you think you can do anything?" she said with a mocking tone. "You've lived isolated for years. You've been kept out of everything. You have no power here." I lifted my head, feeling the cold shiver running down my spine, like my mother's voice echoing inside me. "You're wrong," I said. "I never lost power. I just never needed to use it." Clarissa froze, but Ryan clenched his fists, his face flushing red. "Step out of this now," he snarled. I turned to Emily, looking into her swollen eyes, then looked at the two standing before me, the ones who had chosen brutality as their law. I knew I couldn't fight them with my hands, but I carried something they would never dare defy. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, my hand steady with purpose. "What are you doing?" Clarissa asked, her voice dropping as unease crept into her expression. I looked straight at them, holding their gaze for a long breath. "I'm calling the one person you don't dare cross," I said, my voice level sharp like a blade. I dialed the familiar number of the family council. And in that moment, I knew the war was about to begin. The ringing tone echoed in the receiver like a hammer striking the history of the Belmonts. I stood in the hallway, my back straight, my hand resting on Emily's shoulder so she would know I was still here, still shielding her until the storm outside was swept away. Clarissa and Ryan stood across from us, and by the third ring, the arrogance in their eyes began to crack. Because they knew if the person I was calling picked up every ounce of power they held would collapse beneath them like crumbling earth. The call connected. A deep, steady male voice answered, strong enough that even Clarissa flinched. I didn't hesitate, didn't speak in circles, didn't allow a single breath for interference. The sub-branch has committed crimes, I said, my voice not loud but landing like a sentence. I request an emergency hearing. The other end fell silent for a breath, then a reply came. How much time do you need? 8 minutes, I said. Everyone must be present. I hung up. Clarissa lunged forward, her face draining of color. You've lost your mind, Margaret. You think just one sentence from you can make the council come running? I looked at her like someone watching a person cling to the last scrap of stolen power. I don't need to think. I know. Emily tightened her grip around my hand. I heard her quiet, shaky breathing, and I knew I was no longer fighting for the reputation of the original branch. I was fighting for this girl's life. Only minutes later, the sound of engines braking at the gate thundered through the property. Headlights cut through the glass panes, illuminating the once dark entryway. A group of figures stepped inside with unmistakable bearing because they belonged to the highest tier of authority in Crestfall. The family council had arrived. The chief advisor entered first, silver hair tied back, eyes sharp like a drawn blade. Behind him came 3 lawyers of the main bloodline, then the family security division in gray uniforms, and finally the council's representative Alexander Belmont, the man with absolute authority over every family decision. Clarissa stepped back, breath breaking into fast, disbelieving gasps. Ryan's face drained as well. The same hand that had once crushed Emily's wrist, now trembling weakly like that of a guilty child. Alexander stopped in front of me. Margaret, he said, you have invoked the intervention rights of the original branch. From this point, all decisions fall to you. Do you have evidence? I handed him my mother's letter, the 2017 file, the blacklist, and the notes regarding Emily. Each document passed through the hands of the council members, and their expressions shifted from stern to cold, from cold to furious. No one spoke, yet the air thickened like a storm about to strike. Clarissa forced her way forward. This is exaggerated. Ryan was just heated, and those other women? Accidents. One of the lawyers stepped forward, his voice cutting like steel. This list spans 2 decades. Every victim is tied directly to the sub-branch. These were not accidents. This was systematic, Ryan shouted, his voice cracking. Mother is lying. She's destroying this house. She's trying to kill the sub-branch. I stepped toward him, meeting his eyes with the precision of a blade placed at his throat. I'm not destroying you. You dug your own grave. Alexander adjusted the buttons of his coat. By family law, he said, his tone quiet yet commanding, when the sub-branch deviates from original ethics, the original branch has authority to seize power, punish the offenders, and restore order. Clarissa shot up from her seat. She cannot do that. She has no right. Alexander faced her squarely. Her mother was Eleanor Belmont, the highest-ranking figure of the original bloodline before she passed. That authority transferred directly to Margaret. She outranks you, Clarissa. I stood still, feeling my mother's voice echo through those same words, now spoken by the council. The chief advisor turned to me. Margaret, which action do you want the council to activate first? I looked at Ryan, then at Clarissa, then at Thomas, standing clumsily at the far end of the room, his mask ripped away to show the cowardice he had always tried to hide. I spoke, my tone firm as iron. From this moment, all decisions belong to the original branch. The council nodded in unison. The command was sealed instantly, like a lock snapping shut, severing the sub-branch from its power. Clarissa stumbled back, her lips trembling, and Ryan bit down until blood appeared. They knew they had lost completely. Alexander tilted his head. It is time for sentencing. I glanced at Emily beside me, her eyes still carrying the pain, but for the first time holding a fragile glimmer of hope. I placed my hand on her back, knowing everything I had done was to protect this breath, this life. I faced the council again, inhaled deeply. Punishment needed to descend, not slowly, not gently, but like thunder cracking open the sky. And I knew that moment had begun, because right after the words I was about to say, the sentence would fall like a storm. The council chamber grew heavy as stone when I stood before them, Emily, one step behind me, and the sub-branch standing on the other side like shadows stripped of their final disguise. No one spoke, no one dared breathe too loudly. Every gaze was fixed on Alexander as he placed the dossier onto the table, closing it with a crisp snap that sounded like the breaking of fate. He turned to me. "Margaret, begin." I nodded. "I request that Ryan Belmont be brought before the council." Two members of security stepped forward, pulling Ryan to the center of the room. He struggled, but the trembling in his body revealed the truth that he had never imagined he would face a real judgment. Alexander opened the file, his voice deep and sharp. "Ryan Belmont of the sub-branch is charged with domestic violence, repeated assaults on multiple women, intimidation of witnesses, and participation in the concealment of ethical violations within the family." Ryan's face drained. "No, I didn't do anything wrong. They're framing me." A council lawyer raised a photo. "This is Grace, beaten until her ribs cracked." Another photo. "This is Julia, institutionalized after she accused you." And another. "And this is Emily." Emily lowered her head. I placed my hand on her shoulder so she would know she was no longer alone. Alexander delivered the decree with no room for mercy. By Belmont lineage law, those who harm women repeatedly and systematically are to be expelled from the family. He lifted his eyes to Ryan. "Ryan Belmont, from this moment forward, you are stripped of the Belmont name." The room erupted with shocked whispers. No one thought that word would be uttered in this era because losing the Belmont name meant erasure from history, from wealth, from privilege, from every right tied to the bloodline. A man reduced to a nameless exile. Alexander continued, "You lose all inheritance rights, all authority in family matters, and you will now be investigated by family law enforcement for the 2017 assault and all related cases." Ryan screamed, "Mother, save me!" Clarissa froze. Emily pressed closer to me. I looked at Ryan one last time. "The day you slapped Emily, that was the day you signed your own sentence." Ryan was dragged out of the room, his screams fading as the door shut like a ghost being erased from its own existence. Silence returned, but not the same silence. This was the silence of the next condemned, waiting for the blade. Alexander called out, "Clarissa Belmont." Clarissa stepped forward with none of her former arrogance. She trembled, gripping her skirt as if trying to hold on to her last scrap of power. A council member opened the second file. 32 incidents orchestrated by you. 10 missing persons. 5 severely injured. 8 forced into psychiatric facilities. All of them women connected to the sub-branch. Clarissa tried to steady her voice. "I did it for the honor of the family." Alexander looked at her, his gaze sharp enough to cut. "No, you did it for power, and now that power is gone." He struck the table lightly. "The council declares Clarissa Belmont the most malicious woman in sub-branch history." Gasps rippled through the room, horrified and disbelieving. That title was a blow worse than exile carved onto her name, like a stain that would never fade. Clarissa collapsed to her knees, eyes wild with the shock of someone stripped of every final layer of pretense. But the one I waited to face was still hiding in the shadows behind them. Thomas. Alexander signaled. Thomas Belmont, step forward. Thomas moved, his face pale as paper. He looked at me, his hands twisting together, then suddenly dropped to his knees in the center of the room. The thud echoed through the wooden floor. Margaret, I know I was wrong. Please forgive me. I did it to preserve family order. I was misguided. Give me another chance. I stared at him, my eyes dry, free of any tears left to shed. All these years he lived beside me, lied to me, used my status to shield the cruelty of the sub-branch. I turned away without a word. Clarissa's defeated breaths, Ryan's distant screams, the sound of the door slamming shut like a final verdict, all blended into the downfall of the Belmont sub-branch. Alexander turned to me. Margaret, the sub-branch has fallen. I didn't look at them nor at the collapsing remnants of their stolen authority. I looked at Emily. Her eyes were red but brighter than ever. And I knew among all this destruction, there was still one thing left for me to do. There was only one person I needed to protect. After the sentence for the sub-branch was delivered, the council chamber felt as though a weight centuries old had finally been lifted. Soft murmurs of relief rippled along the rows of council members, but I did not look at them. I looked only at Emily. She stood there slightly hunched, her hands gripping the hem of her sleeve, as if she could not believe she had actually survived the darkest chapter of her life. When I stepped closer, her eyes reddened, then overflowed in a trembling breath. She collapsed into my arms, shaking like a child finding shelter after a storm. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the fragility that had endured in silence for so long. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be alive, she whispered, her voice so small it felt like it might shatter the room if spoken louder. Her words tightened something deep in my chest, pulling forth the memory of every woman who once stood where Emily stood, but had no one to shield them. I placed my hand on her hair and whispered back, "From now on, no one will ever touch you again." When Emily stepped away, I took her hand and walked with her toward the front. The council waited. Alexander stood at the center, his gaze expectant, as though waiting for the final decree from the bearer of the original bloodline. I stepped into the circle of members, my spine straight, my breath steady. For the first time, I didn't feel like the woman secluded in the guest house, but the rightful successor to Eleanor Belmont's authority. "I have one final request," I said. No one objected. Everyone remained still. I looked at each face as though inspecting every soul awaiting judgment. A new law. Any woman who enters this family shall be protected as if she were of the original bloodline. The room stirred like stones dropping into a deep lake. A law never spoken in over a century, strong enough to dismantle the foundation of cruelty the sub-branch had built. Alexander nodded solemn. The council accepts. I knew my mother, wherever she now rested, must have been smiling because the Belmont family was finally returning to the path she had protected all her life. Emily was invited to step before the council. She tried to compose herself, but her hand still clung to my sleeve. An elder lifted the ceremonial staff of the original line, struck it once on the floor, then declared, "From this day forward, Emily Carter Belmont is recognized as the woman of the future main line." Emily's head lifted, her eyes widening. She had once been treated as an outsider, beaten, threatened, humiliated, used as a sacrifice for the sub-branch. Now she stood in the light, protected by the highest law, given a position no one could tarnish or diminish. The sub-branch was officially dissolved, all authority transferred to the main line. Clarissa stripped of her honor, Ryan stripped of his name, Thomas stripped of leadership and placed under strict supervision. A dark era closed like a heavy door slamming shut after one final scream from those who once wielded cruelty as power. I looked around the room at the faces of those who had lived in fear of the sub-branch, now standing straighter, breathing deeper, as though chains long worn had finally broken. I stepped to the council table and placed my hand on the Belmont crest. From today, I said, my voice unwavering, I will restore the Belmont family to its true ethics. Every member bowed in agreement. No one resisted. No one doubted. They all knew that after everything unveiled that night, only I could lead the family back to the light. Emily stood at my side, her gaze filled with deep gratitude, something that needed no words to convey its weight. I knew she would carry the scars of the past, but now she was protected by the family law, by the authority of the original blood, and by my own vow. As the meeting dissolved, night wind drifted in from Holloway through an open door, carrying the scent of a new beginning. I walked ahead, Emily following, and the house that had once been a place of shadows for countless women now began to reclaim its light. I paused at the stone steps and looked up at the crestfall sky. The stars gleamed like my mother's eyes watching from above. In that moment, I knew my journey had reached its end, but the journey to protect every woman who entered this lineage would continue with me holding the torch. I whispered softly a closing line to the story I had lived, endured, and risen from. I am Margaret Belmont, and I ended the darkness with my own blood. The night sky remained still, but I knew my mother's voice would echo on, guiding me to guard that light forever.